All right, so here's part two of the first lecture. In reality, the first video should have just been a lecture done on syllabus day, and then this would have been the first real lecture. Well, actually, the first lecture would have been a real lecture, but it would have been done on syllabus week, and then this week would have been training the aerobic energy system. So there's a decent amount of slides. I'm going to try to go kind of quick so I don't have such a large video, um, if I can. There's a lot, so I'm going to try to move kind of fast. If you need to, you could pause, rewind, listen again, and there might be some slides I might just skim over that you could read over on your own. Just again, the size of the first video was so large, it took a long time to export, upload. Um, so I'm going to try to see if I can make these videos a little bit shorter and just pinpoint key things throughout the slides. So we started with just basic training principles. We're going to go into the aerobic system now. Next, we'll go into the skeletal muscular system and the neuromuscular system. So we'll do aerobic now. How training affects your aerobic system, really four ways: ventilation, your blood flow, central to peripheral, and then metabolism at the local muscle. These adaptations remain independent of race, gender, age, and health. Um, so realize that these will occur with everybody. In terms of metabolic adaptations, aerobic training improves capacity um, for your respiratory control in skeletal muscles. So endurance trained skeletal muscle fibers contain a lot more mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, where we're going to go through aerobic metabolism. That's going to allow us to use oxygen as well. Oxygen is going to be needed to be used to help in the process of making a fuel source. We won't get into that right now. But more mitochondria is going to be extremely important. You're going to see that in aerobic trained athletes are going to have a lot more mitochondria per skeletal muscle fiber, especially in those, if it's a runner, in the calves, quadriceps, hamstrings, glutes, stuff like that, compared to a non-active individual or a resistance trained individual or something like that. You'll see increased intramuscular fatty acid oxidation. This is extremely important because, as you know, if we're thinking aerobic metabolism or aerobic energy or aerobic training, we're going to be doing longer distance or longer timed exercises. We're going to need to be able to tap into our fats as fuel. We'll have a greater intramuscular fat. Storage of intramuscular fat isn't a negative in terms of training, especially with athletes, because that gives you a fuel source right there. We don't then have to mobilize fat from the torso or somewhere else within the body if we have intramuscular fat right there at that local working muscle. And we know that we get a lot of energy from fat, a lot of ATP. So it's important that we're able to tap into that as a fuel source throughout aerobic activity. So we have greater blood flow within that trained muscle. More blood flow means better chance of bringing in fresh oxygenated blood and removing byproducts, so we could train longer, train harder potentially. Um, Enhances the mitochondrial respiratory capacity and decreases catecholamine release. So there's a long list here. We don't need to memorize all these of factors that could limit your aerobic performance. You could have it somewhere within ventilation, somewhere within muscle metabolism, within peripheral blood flow, or within central blood flow. So things like cardiac output, stroke volume, heart rate, blood pressure can all be factors that can play a role in limiting your aerobic performance. It's a random sound in my house. I apologize. Um, your how much you could breathe, how fast you breathe, the types of fibers that are being used for that activity, the amount of muscle mass you have, blood flow, capillary density. All those can play a role in your limitation to your aerobic capacity or your end aerobic performance. I guess I probably should have slid this slide back one. But aerobic training enhances fat catabolism, which means fat breakdown in submax exercise. So if you have someone that prior to aerobic training protocol would be in the yellow, someone after a series of aerobic training protocols would be in the red, and you see that in the yellow, prior to training, most of their energy is coming from carbs, while less energy is coming from fats. Then after a training program, you'll see that they'll use less carbs as energy and utilize more fats. Total energy really has stayed the same pre-post for the amount of exercise that they might be performing, but as we become more aerobically trained, we tend to start to understand, or our bodies get used to or adapted into how to use fat as fuel. Not always necessary. Carbs are a quick burning fuel. It's a lot easier on the body to burn carbs. So when you're new to an exercise program, the body's going to take the easiest source of fuel it can get, and that's going to be carbohydrates. Fat takes longer to become a fuel source within the body. If you start to train aerobically, the body starts to figure that out and starts to figure out how to utilize fats more than the carbs, and ends up storing some of those carbs so that, if you need to push harder, sprint, challenge yourself, you do have that storage of carbs in you instead of depleting all those prior to exercise or during the beginning of exercise, let's say. So that kind of leads to carbohydrate metabolism. I was just talking about fat metabolism. Trained muscle exhibits enhanced capacity to oxidize carbs during max exercise, reduce carb as fuel, and increase fatty acid in submax exercise. This is due to decreased muscle glycogen use, like the need to use the carbs, reduced glucose reduction, and reduced plasma-borne glucose. So the nice thing about aerobic training and its capability of switching between fuels is that once you become more aerobically trained during your submax exercise, you're going to be using more fats as fuel. But if you need to go to max, you're going to have those carbohydrates there as a source of fuel. So you'll have some stored carbs there for that last sprint at the end of a race or whatever it might be, where if you're a beginner, you're going to probably burn through most of those carbs right away, and you're not going to have that explosive burst maybe left in you at the end of a race as a trained athlete might. In aerobic athletes or aerobic training, we see changes in fiber type. Most aerobic trained athletes or aerobic individuals or endurance athletes have larger slow twitch fibers than fast twitch fibers in the same muscle. Slow twitch fibers are great for being fatigue resistant, for generating ATP aerobically, contain a lot of myoglobin, a lot of aerobic potential within the slow twitch fibers. So you'll see that aerobic training will, if you're a primarily only aerobic trained athlete, you're going to see a large amount of slow twitch muscle. If you transition from being a fast twitch athlete like a sprinter into more of an endurance style athlete, you will see somewhat of a shift from fast twitch to slow twitch. We have they don't necessarily, they can mimic a fast twitch, can then mimic a slow twitch fiber, or at least some of the components to it. But more aerobically trained athletes tend to have a greater amount of slow twitch fibers. So some cardiovascular adaptations with training, you could follow this whole flow chart. There's a lot of things that can increase here. We're not going to go over every single step, but one thing to look at, and probably the most important things, is the increased max stroke output, the increased max cardiac output, the blood flow to the active muscle, how important our cardiac output is. So we usually don't see too much change in heart rate through training. Our max heart rate is usually, stays fairly stable. We don't really increase our max heart rate too much. But if you understand the equation for cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, if we're going to increase our cardiac output and heart rate's going to stay the same, we're probably going to have to see an improvement in stroke volume. So an increase in stroke volume will tend to lead into an increase in cardiac output. An increase in stroke volume is really how much blood we're pumping per beat. So if we can eject more blood, push more blood into the periphery to the working muscle, the better off we are for getting fresh oxygen there and removing byproduct. One thing you might see is enlargement in hearts with physical activity, especially aerobic activity, and that's what we call athlete's heart. Now, you could have an enlargement of a heart that's more of a medical condition, but this is actually something where the heart actually increases in thickness, in size, and that is due to it being a muscle, a working muscle. You're challenging it just like you would your biceps or your quadriceps or anything like that, and it will grow as well to meet the demands that you're putting on it. So long-term aerobic training can increase heart's mass and volume with greater left ventricle and diastolic volumes during rest and exercise. So the left ventricle really is where we're going to see the change within the heart. Cardiac enlargement characterized by eccentric hypertrophy and concentric hypertrophy. So we see it through both types of movement. Endurance athletes that average 25% larger heart volume than sedentary counterparts, and training duration affects cardiac size and structure. So how long you train for can have an effect. Here we see different athletes, so from male and female, male in the green, female in the blue, different types of untrained athletes to endurance athletes to shot putters, which are really explosive athletes, to more types of endurance runners. If you look at your left ventricle mass, you'll see that endurance athletes have a very or a much higher size left ventricle than an untrained individual. One thing you will see is that the largest heart is within the shot putter, which is not an endurance athlete. That's a very explosive athlete, and someone like a shot putter has to give all that person can in one extreme burst, or one extreme movement, one explosive movement, maybe not extreme, explosive movement. So someone like a strength and power athlete might need to really burst a lot of, burst is probably a bad word when you talk about the heart, push out, eject a lot of blood really, really, really forcefully and powerfully and fast. So that's why they might have a larger left ventricle than endurance athletes. Here's cardiac dimensions of different populations again: runners, swimmers, wrestlers, and shot putters. And if you look at left ventricle mass, you'll see again that the shot putters have the largest mass. If you look at the left ventricular wall size, again, largest within the shot putters. Stroke volume, though, look at the difference in stroke volume between college runners and shot putters. Completely different. Huge difference. How much blood is being ejected. Yeah, you'll see that in our runners that's going to be a lot more important, that we have continually pushing a lot of blood out to the working muscle as often as possible in reality, because we need to flush out those byproducts and bring new, fresh, clean, oxygenated blood to that working muscle for the use of, or the help in producing energy. So here's functional versus pathological cardiac hypertrophy. You can have an enlargement of the heart based on disease. Pathologic hypertrophied heart is enlarged, distended, functionally inadequate organ, unable to deliver blood. So you can have people that have an enlarged heart, and it's not a good thing. Exercise related heart increases is not a problem at all. But when you have it as a disease state, it can become a really big problem. It poses a serious stress on the body. Athlete's heart does not represent a dysfunction. It actually demonstrates normal systolic and diastolic functions. So if you're ever in a situation where you see someone that has thick left ventricle and they're currently an athlete, it's something that you probably won't have to be concerned with. Now, if you have a sedentary individual or sedentary patient or an older adult that does, that could be a situation that you need to look into quite quickly. Actually, it's probably pretty dangerous. You'll see increases in plasma volume through training. 12 to 20% increase in plasma volume occurs really quickly within aerobic sessions. This enhances circulatory reserve and end diastolic volume, stroke volume, oxygen transport, VO2 max, temperature regulation, all that stuff during exercise. It's a very positive thing. Expanded plasma volume returns to pre-training levels after training. So plasma increases in plasma volume can have a lot of positive effects. Again, I apologize if I'm going fast, and you can read through these, but I also want to minimize the amount of time you have to watch a video. Heart rate. Training decreases the firing rate of the SA node, which is like your pacemaker. Usually, you don't see a ton of change you won't really see any change in max heart rate, but you might see a decrease in your resting heart rate, some max heart rate that could all go down slightly, or depending on where you're at already, could be pretty good. So sub-max heart rate from standard exercise decreases by 12 to 15 beats per minute by training. Small heart rate decrease for resting heart rate, and reduction coincides with increased max stroke volume and cardiac output. So you'll see that when your stroke volume goes up, you might see a little bit of with your improvement in fitness, you'll see increases in stroke volume and potential decreases in your heart rate. Your body, you're pumping out a lot of blood. You don't need to be pumping out really, really, really fast too. A lot of times, if you have small stroke volume, to maintain cardiac output, you're going to have a really high heart rate. So think about it, if you're trying to pump blood to the working muscle and you're only pumping out a little bit of blood, you're going to have to pump a lot. So it means your heart rate's going to be going, 180 beats per minute, pop, 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 to get as much blood to the working muscle. Now, if you're pumping up a ton of blood with every pump, your heart doesn't have to pump as many times. It's getting more blood per pump. Your stroke volume is greater, more ejection of oxygenated blood each pump, so you can have a lower heart rate then through training. Here you see heart rate and VO2 during exercise, graded exercise, so things are getting more difficult in athletes and sedentary individuals. Sedentary students are in the yellow. Sedentary students after training in the blue, so you see that, and then you have your endurance athletes. And then you see after training, heart rate max about the same. Oxygen consumption is clearly improved, but you do definitely see a improvement in resting heart rate or submax heart rate, and it takes longer for the subjects after training in the blue line to see that increase in heart rate. So here, if you look at 160 beats per minute for the trained subjects in the blue, they were at 2.0 liters per minute in oxygen consumption, where for them to be at 160 beats per minute, they were at 1.7 maybe liters per minute. So you see that shift to the right after training in heart rate. So I mentioned stroke volume a lot already. Endurance training causes stroke volume to increase during rest, and heart stroke volume to increase during rest and exercise regardless of age and gender. Factors that can increase this is the left ventricle being larger, reduced cardiac and arterial stiffness. So the heart's able to expand more, fill more. Think of it like a balloon, and a very expandable balloon instead of like a very stiff, hard balloon that you're trying to blow air into. You can barely get any air in. It's really tough to do. This one can just expand greatly through training. It gets very pliable. It can really accept more blood. So you could fill more. End diastolic filling gets greater, and then you get intrinsic cardiac function can improve. So when you're comparing stroke volume between trained and untrained individuals, athletes' heart exhibits much greater stroke volume during rest and exercise, which also will lend itself to that lower heart rate in trained individuals. Greatest stroke volume increase during upright exercise for trained and untrained occurs in transition from rest to moderate exercise. Stroke volume occurs between 40 and 50% of the VO2 max in an untrained individual. So at that point, if you want to improve cardiac output, your heart needs to start beating faster and faster, about 40 to 50% of your VO2 max. So you could pump as you're starting to train, as you're trying to do like essentially a VO2 max test. As you're starting to reach 40 to 50% of your VO2 max, the heart is pumping as much blood as it could pump at that point. So all you can really do is increase the amount of times it's going to pump if you want to keep going. So that's why your heart rate will continually rise. to max. Well, that's why you'll be able to your cardiac output will continue to rise to reach max by increase the heart rate. So here's an image of that sedentary college students in the yellow. The blue is them after training compared to what an endurance athlete is. So you see the stroke volume after training. It through action, looking at the action consumption line, we see prior to training, their stroke volume is pretty low in the beginning. It peaks around about 50%. If you think of their max being 2.5 liters per minute, maybe 1.5, a little more than 50% is when they finally peak at their stroke volume. But you actually see changes throughout most of their stroke volume as they go through a training program. You see stroke volume is maxed way higher than it was pre-training. Nowhere near an endurance athlete. Look how far it is, how great their stroke volume is, and clearly what their VO2 max is significantly greater than this college students. But you definitely see improvements in stroke volume through training. Cardiac output we talked about already, and really it's your heart rate times your stroke volume. So increases in cardiac output is most significant adaptation with aerobic training. That's probably the most important thing in aerobic training. Mainly this comes from improved stroke volume. Again, you don't really see as much change in heart rate. In trained athletes, cardiac output increases linearly with VO2 throughout most of exercise intensity. A training-induced reduction in submax cardiac output reflects two things. You're able to distribute your blood better. So if you see a reduction in your submax cardiac output, that's not really a problem at all. You're just able to distribute the blood with every pump a lot better. And trained muscles enhance capacity to generate ATP aerobically at lower tissue partial pressure of oxygen. So it's a lot easier for it to pull oxygen in and push out byproduct than it was previously when you were kind of an untrained muscle. So it's a lot easier for it to take in that fresh blood. So here you have someone with a heart problem. They have mitral stenosis. You have a sedentary individual with essentially a healthy heart, and then you have an athlete. So you have essentially a diseased heart, a healthy heart, and then an athletic heart. And you see great increases in VO2 max with each individual. You'll see max heart rates not very different between all three of them. That stays about the same. But you see great increases in cardiac output between the three groups. And mainly that's going to be from your stroke volume. Your athlete's going to have greater amount of stroke volume compared to your sedentary individuals compared to your individuals that really struggle to pump blood. And here's that same group of individuals that we were looking at previously. Yellow is the sedentary college students, and then the blue is them after training, aerobic training, compared to the purple, which is the elite athletes. And you see cardiac output improves over training. And as you would imagine that because we just looked at stroke volume improving, we just looked at heart rate improving. We would know then if both of those we would see an improvement in our cardiac output. So we see also an improvement in AVO2 difference, so us extracting oxygen out of the blood. Aerobic training increases quantity of O2 extracted from that circulating blood. So in the beginning, when you're not that fit, you really struggle to pull some of that oxygenated blood or oxygen out of the blood into the working muscle. The fitter you get, the more trained you get, there's more capillary density. There's a greater capacity for you to extract that O2 out of that blood into the working muscle. Same thing again, as we mentioned before, as we see improvements in AVO2 difference through a training protocol. Again, you could look at that as well. Lower cardiac output in some exercise with training leads to rapid training-induced changes in vasoactive properties of large arteries and muscle cell changes that enhance oxidative capacity. So when we think about blood flow and how it gets distributed, the body gets a lot better at vasodilating, vasoconstricting, and either vasodilating in areas that need the blood, vasoconstricting in areas that do not. Sorry, my dog is jumping around upstairs. It's freaking me out. I don't know what it's doing up there. Um, Muscle cell changes also enhance oxidative capacity, so the muscle cell itself um, becomes a lot more adept at taking in that blood. Um, Again, it could have more capillary beds, more mitochondria. All these things play a role in just not just the blood getting there, but then also extracting the oxygen out. So during max exercise, we have larger cardiac output, greater blood distribution to muscle from non-active areas, and a larger number of cross-sectional areas of arteries and veins. So again, they can vasodilate, get more blood there. Heart blood flow. You might have vascular modifications like increased cross-sectional area of coronary arteries, collateral vessels, increased capillary density of the heart, a lot more perfusion for increased blood flow and energy demands. Training increases this coronary blood flow and capacity from actually changing the heart, structuring, remodeling to improve vascularization and more effective control of vascular resistance and blood distribution within the heart. So the heart gets a lot better at distributing its blood, getting the blood back, increasing its pumping abilities, increasing the sizes of the vessels around it, increasing the size of the arteries around it for it to get more blood in and out. It remodels itself. It improves. It grows. It changes as training goes on. Regular aerobic training reduces your systolic and diastolic blood pressure during rest and submax, but not too much during your max. Largest reduction occurs in the systolic. You'll see usually if someone with high blood pressure, let's say they're 160 over 90, 160 systolic over 90 diastolic. Usually when you see the changes, you'll see greater changes in the systolic than you will in the diastolic. You might see them go 110 over 80, drop 50 off that systolic and maybe only 10 off that diastolic. So you see a lot more changes in that systolic than you do in the diastolic. Other changes include blood lactate concentration. So endurance training lowers your blood lactate levels and extends exercise before the onset of blood lactate accumulation, which means you could exercise for longer and harder. A lot of this has to do with the increased, all the things we mentioned before, but really that increased blood flow to the working muscle, which means that you're getting more oxygen to it. You're able to buffer out a lot of that byproduct of hydrogen ions, lactic acid, pyruvate, getting that out of there, shuttling it either to create more energy or to buffer so that you keep muscle from getting too acidic. Those all can allow you to train harder for longer. You won't feel that burning sensation. So decreasing rate of lactate formation, increasing rate of lactate clearance, and combined effects can all help you improve your exercise intensity. And this really is the major key difference between elite athletes. Usually using the VO2 max as the separator. It's when someone has that blood lactate accumulation, the onset of blood lactate accumulation, that point where they just can't go any farther. They might not have reached their VO2 max, but their lactate is built up so much that they have to stop. So if you can push this orange line farther to the right where the yellow line is, you will see that you're going to be able to train harder, longer. So that's really what can, doing something like a Wingate test and looking at for the onset of blood lactate. When you're doing those kind of tests, two people could have essentially the same VO2 max, but for the person that could last longer in a test like a Wingate test, before they feel that onset of blood lactate, really that your legs are just burning so much that you can't go anymore. That kind of feeling is what's going to stop someone from really being elite. You could work on that. Other training adaptations are improvement in body composition. If we're going to be using fat as fuel, there's a good chance we might see some improvement in our body composition. Being much better at releasing heat. A lot of blood flow. We could have blood flow to the periphery. We could have release out of that heat. Enhanced endurance performance. Clearly, if you're doing aerobic training, you probably would be better at endurance performance. And some positive psychological benefits like reducing anxiety, um, better mood, self-esteem, what's the word I was looking for? Self-efficacy, reduction in various indices of psychological stress. So there's a lot of things that um, we can see, positive benefits we could see from aerobic training. There's also changes in the muscle, cross-sectional size of the slow twitch, increases in capillary density, increases in muscle glycogen, oxidative potential of fast twitch fibers, and great increase in aerobic enzymes. As we train, as you can see, between up to 2 years, we're seeing increases as we go. Cross-sectional size, at some point, those muscles fibers are going to peak. They're not going to keep growing and growing and growing. They'll hit a stopping point. But things like aerobic enzymes can continue, and those are kind of things in oxidative potential of those fast twitch fibers. Remember I said that fast twitch can start acting like slow twitch. Those fast twitch can start being more oxidative and kind of mimicking what a slow twitch fiber might do. Increasing in capillary beds, capillary density. All these things can help play a role at the muscular level to improve your aerobic fitness. And as you see, within 6 months of no training, they all dive bomb right back down. So some factors that affect aerobic training responses is how fit you are in the beginning, how hard you're going to train, how often you're going to train, and how long for you're going to train. So your training age, your intensity, frequency, and duration. Most of the response, magnitude of your response, really depends on how fit you are. I'm not cardiovascular fit right now. If I get into a training protocol, I'm probably going to see some pretty large increases right off the bat. Someone who rates low at the start has considerable room for improvement. That would be me. If you're already very fit, you're going to be at what we call I talked about it in the first lecture, is the law of diminishing returns. You're going to have to train really hard to see very little improvements. You might be a marathon runner right now. You put a lot into it, you're going to see small gains. Me, I don't have to put much into it to see large gains right now. Aerobic fitness improvements with endurance training range from 5 to 25%. So you could see 5% increase in aerobic fitness or VO2 max up to 25%. Intensity, training-induced adaptations rely mostly on overloading the system in some fashion. Ways you could do that is by increasing the distance you ran, increasing the speed. Well, when we think about just aerobic training, those would be the two major ones. How fast you ran, how far you ran, for how long you ran. I was thinking something else. Ways we express exercise intensity is usually energy per time, so how many calories you burn per minute. That's usually what you see a lot of times on like treadmills and stuff. Absolute exercise level or your power output. Sometimes on like Woodway treadmills, they'll give you a power output, or on bikes, sometimes they will. Relative metabolic level, you could look at your VO2 max. You could look at when your onset blood lactate occurs, which is kind of hard to do because you need to be taking blood when you do that. What is most common for people training and programming is going to be usually the bottom three, and that's working at a percent of heart rate max, looking at someone's MET levels, or scripting how many MET levels they should work out at, and then someone's perceived exertion. This is off a 6 to 20 scale, but 0 to 10, either one. So if you're looking to train at a heart rate percentage, this is probably the most common way to script aerobic training for somebody, is especially if they have a heart rate monitor or some kind of activity tracker with a heart rate thing, like an Apple Watch or something. You can see aerobic capacity improvements at exercise intensities between 55 and 70% of max. What that's saying is you don't need to be going 90 to 100% to see change. When it comes to improving aerobic capacity, you could be in that moderate range between 55 and 70% to see someone improve. So if you know someone's max heart rate, you could fairly easily give them a range at 55 to 75% of that max heart rate that they should be training at. So if you're going to do the Karvonen method for someone that needed to increase their aerobic fitness, you would take their heart rate at rest, let's say it's 60 beats per minute. You would do heart rate max times heart rate, or heart rate max minus heart rate rest. So you'd say, let's say it's 220 minus is their heart rate max. Their um, yeah, let's say age predicted max heart rate's 200 minus our heart rate rest. It's 60, so it'd be 140. You would times that by whatever percentages, so it'd be 140 times 0.55, and then 140 times 0.7, and then each one you would add that resting heart rate back in. So again, what you would do is you would take the heart rate max. If you just use someone's age predicted max heart rate, and again, if let's say it's a 20-year-old, that would be 220 minus their age, which would be 200 beats per minute, and their resting heart rate, let's say, is 60. You say 200 minus 60, that's 140. Times it by whatever range you want them to work out at, but we just said 55 to 70 would be beneficial. So you could take that number and times it by 0.55. So if 140, I don't have a calculator on me, actually I could do it right here. 140 times 0.55, so you're looking at 77, then you'd add that resting heart rate back in, which is 60. So on the low end, they should be working around a heart rate at 137 beats per minute. At the high end, it would be 140 times 0.7 plus 60. So they'd be working around 158 beats per minute on the high end. That's how you'd be able to build a range for someone that wanted to train. If they want to know what fitness level they should work at based on their heart rate, someone would be in this would be somewhere like that 135 to 155 range. If they're working at 55 to 70% using the Cargone method, which is a very good method. So just remember, achieving positive adaptations does not mean you have to go extremely hard. Healthy people can see training at around heart rate around 70%. Heart rate max represents moderate activity without discomfort. People can have conversational exercise, which means they can actually talk to you and still see improvements. They don't need to be sprinting and puking and panting to make aerobic changes. They just need to be able to have moderate, somewhat strenuous exercise. It doesn't need to be super, super, super difficult, but you do have to understand that it does need to get more difficult over time. Things become really simple for people over time, so you need to make sure that if it's increasing mileage, if it's increasing the intensity, if it's increasing the METs, if it's increasing what the heart rate max might be, or excuse me, the heart rate range might be, you need to do something to make things more difficult. So here you have essentially what's that training sensitive zone, which we kind of were just talking about. What here they have 70% is the yellow dots, 90% is the orange dots, and well, I guess I would call orange. And you could train really anywhere in there. You could train again down to the 60% up to 90%. But again, the body doesn't necessarily need all that to see some change. You could do training with perceived exertion. This has become more popular. So RPEs are an easy way to do things, especially on a 0 to 10 scale. So if you have something that looks like this, it's really easy to tell someone, if 10 is the hardest thing you've ever done and 0 is the easiest thing you've ever done, can you work at a 6? Can you work at a 5? Can you work at an 8? Can you work at a 9? So the Omni is a 0 to 10 scale, and that's the easiest way to do it. Borg is a 6 to 20 scale, and that really correlates to heart rate. It's like adding a 0 to the RP scale. So if you got a 6 on the RP scale, it's like you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute. If you get a 20, which is like max, it's like 200 beats per minute. That's why it's written that way. If you're saying I'm a 14 on the RP scale, it's equivalent. It's just making a guess that you're at 140 beats per minute. So you could give someone the Borg scale to have for them to train, but the Omni RPE is probably the easiest one for most people to just go 0 to 10, and they understand that. Training at lactate threshold is really hard because you need to know the onset of blood lactate, and you actually probably would have to train and take blood while training, which becomes very, very difficult. It has a great benefit. If you could figure out where your heart rate is, what your VO2 max is, something that you could use at home to know when the onset of blood lactate came. A lot of times it's comparing percent heart rate max and lactate threshold. So you see this large curve. If I go back a couple slides, this is going to go really slow. It's going too slow. Should be right here though. There it is. this slide right here, if you know pre-training that you have this onset of blood lactate at this point right here, if you know what percent of that max heart rate is for you, let's say this is, if you can get to max heart rate, this is 190 beats per minute. And here, at this vicinity right here, you are at 110. You know this is your onset of blood lactate. If you can know that range, you could train around that range. And if you could, work out a specific level or intensity to try to improve that, you could then push that graph or that line on that graph to the right farther, so that you could keep training harder for longer, and that's actually quite important. So, I probably could just do it right here. That's just stupid. I didn't realize I put this graph in here. So here you have the onset of blood lactate. Here we know your running speed. Here we might know your heart rate. And now you could train at this point to try to improve that, try to shift this yellow line to the right. And that would be the goal. In terms of training duration, there's no specific duration that you need to train to improve your aerobic capacity. No threshold per workout exists. If a threshold exists, it depends on interaction of usually how much work you're getting done, so the total volume, how hard you did it at, how often you've been training, and again, your fitness levels, the things we talked about in the beginning. In terms of frequency, the more frequent you train, the more benefit you might get, as long as you're not too sore or too tired. Extra quantity of exercise represents considerable calories burned, with potential improvements in health. To produce weight loss with exercise, each session should last minimum 60 minutes at burning around 300 calories. That's variable. That's out of the textbook, and it's a variable statement. I don't know if it has to be 60 minutes. If it's at just a moderate exercise intensity, maybe that's what you need to burn 300 calories or more. Typical aerobic programming is usually about 3 days a week, where you get some rest in between. Mode, or what type of exercise, really depends on the individual and what your goals are. If you can do things that involve large muscle groups, that's better. It means you're going to challenge the heart to pump more blood to more working muscle. Also, you're going to burn more calories because you're using more muscle mass, so you're going to have to burn more calories. Both are great things and great reasons. So things like running, swimming are really good options. Biking, rowing, Stairmaster, those are also great too. And they burn a lot of calories, and they will challenge the heart. How long before you see some improvements? You can see them actually quite quickly, within a couple of weeks, especially if you're very unfit. So it does kind of play a role in your initial training age, or how fit you are in the beginning. Adaptive responses eventually level off, so at some point you reach your genetic potential, and you just won't be able to see any more gains made. Cardiovascular adaptations occur with short-term exercise training. So, trainability and genes. Strenuous exercise enhances the level of fitness regardless of genetic background. So, some people might be able to train harder, train longer, be faster, whatever it may be by genetics, but strenuous exercise will help everybody. So no matter who you are, aerobic training you'll benefit from it. Genotype dependency exists for much of one's sensitivity in responding to training. So there is a genetic role. There's a genetic role with everything, but you'll still see improvements no matter what. Maintaining gains in aerobic fitness. Once attained, maintenance of aerobic fitness can involve reduced frequency and duration of training. Intensity is key, so you might not need to go as often or as long, but you still need to go pretty hard, or harder if you're cutting back. With intensity held constant for continued duration, required to maintain aerobic fitness remain lower than required for improvement. So in contrast, a small decline in intensity of effort can reduce your VO2 max. So again, intensity is probably one of the key factors. So I think this might be the last slide, or it's coming up. Factors in formulating some aerobic training protocols. Cardiovascular overload must be intense enough to sufficiently overload stroke volume and cardiac output, so we really need to force the heart to work. And then overload must occur from activation of sport-specific muscle groups to enhance that local circulation. So if you want to improve your running ability, you need to run. You need to challenge those muscles that are involved in running. Brief bouts of a repeated exercise and continuous long duration efforts enhance aerobic capacity as well, provided the intensity is high enough. So, two major goals of aerobic training: one, develop the capacity of the central circulation to deliver oxygen, and two, enhance the capacity of the active musculature to supply and process that oxygen. So those are really the two main goals. Be able to build up the cardiovascular system to actually pump the blood, and then two, enhance aerobic capacity to actually use that that blood that's being delivered to the muscle. Then can you actually take it and use it, which takes training. So I talked quite quick. I apologize if that was really fast, but I wanted a shorter video for you this time. You could always re-listen, review, ask me questions, email me, or we could talk in class next week. So that's the end of video 2, and we'll see you next week at in class where we'll be doing a lab, and I'll send information out on D2L for that. Thanks.